It's the late 18th century, a time when America is still young, restless, untamed, and full of promise. The wind rolls low over the Pennsylvania frontier, bending the long grass and rattling the dry autumn leaves. And somewhere in the thick, wooded valleys near Scranton, in a small, nameless settlement clinging to the edge of civilization, a boy is born. No records remain of the exact day or month he entered the world, but most say it was around 1783, a time of revolution, of change. The war with Britain had just ended, and the United States was beginning to stretch its limbs, pushing westward, deeper into the unknown. But for a child born into the frontier, there was no promise of safety, only struggle, survival, and the whisper of the wilderness calling from beyond the trees. The Pennsylvania frontier wasn't a place for the faint-hearted. Winters came down hard, burying the land under heavy snow. Wolves prowled the edges of settlements at night, their howls curling through the cold. The forests, dense and endless, held dangers both seen and unseen. This was the world young Hugh grew up in, a world where every meal had to be earned, every skill could mean the difference between life and death. His childhood was not one of books or schooling, but of hard labour. His hands learned the weight of an axe before they ever held a pen. By the time he was old enough to walk, he was old enough to work, hauling water, splitting wood, tending to the family's few animals. He learned to track deer in the woods, to move quietly, to read the signs of the land. The frontier was his teacher, and it taught its lessons without mercy. At night, sitting by the fire, he listened to the stories of trappers, hunters, and traders passing through, men with sun-leathered faces and eyes that had seen things no one else could imagine. They spoke of lands beyond the mountains, of rivers so wide you could barely see the other side, of beasts as large as houses roaming the plains. To a boy like Hugh, those stories were like embers, small sparks that would one day grow into a fire, burning away any desire for an ordinary life. But if those stories lit a fire in him, the hardships of the frontier tempered it. By the time he was a young man, he had the toughness of someone who had already endured more than most. He could outwalk, outlast, and outfight men twice his age, and soon the edge of Pennsylvania would not be enough. The call of the unknown was louder than the safety of home, and so, like so many restless souls before and after him, Hugh Glass turned his eyes west, toward the vast, unbroken wilderness. The road west was not a road at all. Half-forgotten trails, deer paths winding through the Pennsylvania forests, rivers swollen with spring melt, and endless miles of prairie stretching toward a horizon that never seemed to come any closer. But Hugh Glass was not a man to be deterred by distance. By the early 1800s he was on the move, though where he first set out is a mystery. Some say he took to the sea, spending time among the pirates of the Gulf of Mexico. Others claim he was captured by the Pawnee and lived among them, learning their ways. What is certain is that, by the time he emerged onto the western frontier, he was no greenhorn. The world he walked into was raw, untamed. The great Missouri River, America's highway into the unknown, cut a silver path through the wilderness, carving deep into lands untouched by white men. Towering cottonwoods lined its banks, their leaves whispering in the wind. Beyond them, the land stretched out in rolling grasslands, home to herds of bison so vast they turned the earth black as they moved. To the west, the Rocky Mountains loomed like jagged teeth, their snow-capped peaks cutting into the sky. The rivers that ran down from them were cold, swift, and unpredictable. Wolves watched from the tree line, their yellow eyes flickering in the twilight. Grizzly bears, kings of this wild domain, ruled the forests and river valleys, their deep-chested growls echoing through the canyons. This was the land of the trappers, the men who lived and died by their wits, hunting the beaver, whose pelts were worth their weight in gold. And this was where he belonged. He signed on with fur trading expeditions, first with smaller outfits, then with the great trading companies that sought to carve wealth from the land. He travelled with men hardened by wilderness, their faces burned by sun and wind, their hands calloused from years of work. They carried hawk and rifles slung across their backs, tomahawks at their belts. They spoke in the rough, clipped language of survival, short words, few wasted. By night they huddled around fires, swapping tales of close calls, of arrows hissing from the tree line, of grizzlies charging from the brush. By day they moved with the rhythm of the land, following the rivers, always searching for the next trapline, the next unspoiled valley teeming with game. He walked the riverbanks of Yellowstone, its waters running clear and cold. He crossed the wide open plains of what is now South Dakota, where the sky stretched on forever and the wind carried the distant calls of elk. He saw the black hills rise from the earth like the back of some slumbering beast, their dark forests rich with game. And everywhere there were people. The Lakota, the Crow, the Arikara, nations older than the land itself. Some were wary, others welcoming. He traded with them, learned from them. The trappers who survived the longest were the ones who understood that they were not masters here. They were guests, stepping lightly on a land that had its own rules, its own dangers. Glass moved through it all, as much a part of the wilderness as the rivers and mountains. But no man can wander the frontier forever without it catching up to him. And one day, in the deep silent woods along the Grand River, something was waiting for him. The air was heavy with the damp scent of earth and pine, the kind of stillness that settles deep in the wilderness just before something happens. It was late summer, 1823, and Hugh was deep in the lands of the Grand River, in what is now present-day South Dakota. He was not alone. The men of General William Henry Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Company had been moving north, a ragged band of trappers, traders, and frontiersmen, pushing deeper into Arikara country in search of new trapping grounds. It was dangerous work. The Arikara, bitter from past betrayals and attacks by white traders, were no friends of the fur companies. Every man in the party knew that at any moment an arrow could whistle out from the trees, a war party could be watching from the bluffs. But it was not warriors that found Hugh Glass that morning. It was something far older, far stronger. He had been scouting ahead of the group, walking alone through the thick brush near the river. The undergrowth was dense, making it impossible to see far. The sounds of the men behind him had faded into the distance, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the rhythmic rush of the river over stone. Then movement, a blur of brown, a heavy muscled shape shifting in the shadows just ahead. He froze, his hand instinctively tightening around his rifle, but it was already too late. The mother grizzly had been watching him long before he saw her, a beast as tall as a man's shoulders on all fours, and twice that when she reared up, her long claws catching the light. She had cubs nearby, and that meant only one thing. There would be no warning, no chance to back away. She came at him like a landslide. The ground shook under the force of her charge. Glass barely had time to raise his rifle before she was on him. He fired point blank, the shot exploding in the still morning air, but the bullet only tore through her shoulder, doing nothing to slow her down. Then came the impact. It was like being hit by a freight wagon. Claws raked down his chest, opening skin and muscle to the bone. Teeth like iron spikes sank into his shoulder. His world became a blur of pain, of hot breath and snarling fury. The grizzly threw him like a rag doll, then pounced again, its weight pressing him into the earth. He fought somehow with nothing but a knife, hacking at fur, stabbing blindly, feeling his blade strike deep over and over. The other trappers, hearing the gunshot and the terrible, ragged roars, came running. By the time they arrived, Glass was barely breathing, his body a ruin of torn flesh and shattered bone. The bear, riddled with stab wounds and a final shot from the arriving men, collapsed beside him, blood pooling into the earth. For a moment there was silence. Then the men gathered around, staring down at what was left of Hugh Glass. No one survived a grisly attack like that. No one. They did what they thought was merciful. General Ashley's orders were clear. There was no time to stop, no time to carry a dying man. They would bury him quickly before the Arikara found them. 2 men were chosen to stay behind and see the job through. John Fitzgerald, a hard-edged frontiersman who put survival above all else, and a younger man, Jim Bridger, barely out of boyhood, still green to the ways of the wild. They dug the shallow grave. They waited. But Hugh Glass wouldn't die. Hours passed. His breath came ragged, wet with blood, but it came. His fingers twitched in the dirt. His eyes flickered open, glassy, unfocused. Fitzgerald saw the writing on the wall. If Glass didn't die soon, they'd have to finish the job themselves. The Arikara were near, and staying behind meant risking their own necks for a man who was already halfway to the other side. So they took his rifle, his knife, his powder horn, anything of value, and they left him. Hugh Glass was alone, broken, torn apart, abandoned, but not dead. When he woke alone, the sky above him was a shifting blur of grey. His vision swam. Flies swarmed his wounds, crawling across raw flesh. He could not lift his arms. He could barely breathe. And yet somewhere deep inside him, past the pain, past the fever and the weakness, there was something else. A cold, unshakable truth. He would not die here. Through the fog of agony, he forced his mind to work. He was in the wilderness, but not lost. The Grand River was nearby. If he could reach it, he could follow its winding path southeast. It would lead him to the Missouri, and the Missouri led to Fort Kiowa, maybe the only place he had a chance of surviving. But Fort Kiowa was 200 miles away, and he couldn't walk. So he crawled. His back oozed with infection, maggots squirming in the wounds. His leg was twisted beneath him, useless. His ribs stabbed at his lungs with every breath. The land did not care. But the land was not finished testing him. At one point he found himself on the banks of the Grand River, the water just beyond his reach. He had no strength left. He collapsed, gasping, unable to move another inch. The fever was rising, the infection in his wounds burning like fire. The world blurred. Then shadows, voices, a Pawnee hunting party. They stood over him, murmuring in their own tongue, perhaps wondering how this ruined, half-dead man had come to be crawling through their land like some wounded animal. They did not kill him. They did not abandon him. They helped him. Broken, torn apart, abandoned. They cleaned his wounds, pressing damp moss into the gaping cuts to draw out the infection. They gave him food, warm and filling, and when he could move again, they let him go. Day by day, inch by inch, he dragged himself through the wilderness. His fingers clawed at the dirt, pulling his broken body forward. Every root, every rock sent a fresh wave of agony through him. The land did not care. The prairie stretched on in endless waves of golden grass, shimmering in the sun. The nights were brutal, the wind cutting through his tattered clothes, the stars staring down at him like distant, indifferent gods. The rivers ran cold, their waters mocking him as he pulled himself forward, inch by inch. He had no food, no weapon, but the wilderness, the same land that had nearly killed him, offered what little mercy it had. He scavenged, berries, roots, anything to keep his body moving. He cracked the bones of rotting carcasses left behind by wolves, sucking out the marrow, swallowing it down with the iron taste of survival. The wolves watched him now, circling, waiting. One night, Glass came across a bison calf, freshly killed, its throat torn open by the pack. The wolves had eaten their fill and left. He dragged himself toward it, his fingers shaking as he tore at the meat with his bare hands, stuffing it into his mouth, raw and dripping. It was enough to keep going. Glass crawled on. He did not remember the moment he saw the fort. Perhaps he smelled the smoke from its chimneys first, the distant scent of cooking fires drifting on the wind. Perhaps he heard the voices, the sound of men speaking a language he had not heard in endless days. All he knew was that one morning, after what must have been months, his ruined body collapsed at the gates of Fort Kiowa. A body covered in dried blood and filth, wounds festering, eyes sunken into a face that no longer looked human. A man who had died 100 times before he arrived there, but he had made it 200 miles, across rivers and plains, through hunger and pain, through a land that had done everything it could to kill him. Glass had survived, and now there was only one thing left to do: find the men who had left him for dead. Fort Kiowa was a modest outpost, a collection of rough-hewn log buildings surrounded by the endless stretch of prairie. To the traders and trappers inside, it was a place of safety, a place where men could drink, trade, and tell their tales of survival in the wild. And then, one day, a dead man arrived at its gates. Hugh Glass was barely recognizable as human. His face was gaunt, his body wasted from hunger and fever. The scars of the grizzly's claws ran deep across his chest, his back a latticework of wounds that had only half healed. His left leg still dragged behind him, stiff and swollen, but his eyes burned with something colder than hatred. The men of the fort gathered around him, astonished that anyone could have survived what he had endured. They gave him food, water, a place to rest. But Glass did not rest easily, not truly, because he had come back for a reason, for Fitzgerald, for Bridger, for the men who had left him in a shallow grave to die. As soon as he was strong enough to move, Hugh Glass set out once more. But this time he had weapons, he had supplies, and most of all he had reason. The hunt for the men who abandoned him took him back into the untamed frontier, but this time he tracked rumours, followed whispers of where they had gone. Jim Bridger had made his way to another fur-trapping outpost. Fitzgerald had disappeared deeper into the frontier, moving further west. Glass found Bridger first. He came upon the man at a trading post, stepping into the firelight like a ghost risen from the dirt. Bridger's young face drained of colour when he saw him, his mouth opening in silent disbelief. Glass could have killed him right there. He could have wrapped his fingers around the boy's throat and watched the soul disappear from his fresh blue eyes. But he didn't. Bridger had been young, barely a man. He had followed Fitzgerald's orders to the letter. Terrified by the older man, convinced that staying behind would have meant his own death. So Glass let him live. Fitzgerald, however, would not be so lucky. It took months, but Glass found his trail. The man had enlisted with the United States Army at Fort Atkinson, thinking himself safe behind military walls. Glass, demanding justice, stormed in. But Fitzgerald was now a soldier under the protection of the government. Killing him would mean his own death. So instead, Hugh Glass did the only thing he could. He took everything from him. Fitzgerald was forced to return the stolen rifle, the one he had taken from Glass's broken body, as he left him to die. He was humiliated, branded a coward in front of his peers, and though Glass did not kill him, he left him with a warning, a promise that if he ever left the army, ever ventured into the wilderness alone without the protection of the military again, Glass would be waiting. Fitzgerald never did. Revenge did not bring peace. Hugh Glass returned to the only life he knew, trapping, trading, moving through the wild lands like a shadow. But the world was changing. The frontier was no longer an endless, lawless place. Settlements grew. Tribes fought against the ever-encroaching tide of traders and settlers. And Glass, as unkillable as he seemed, was still just a man. In 1833, 10 years after he had dragged himself from the dirt and crawled 200 miles to survival, his luck finally ran out. A group of Arikara warriors ambushed his trapping party along the frozen banks of the Yellowstone River. There was no crawling away this time. When the fight was over, Hugh Glass lay dead, his body left behind in the wilderness he had spent his life trying to master. No grave, no marker, no final words. Hugh Glass never had a family of his own. He lived and died on the frontier, a man of the wild, bound to nothing but the land and the endless struggle to survive. His name faded into legend, passed from one trapper to the next, whispered in the flickering light of frontier fires. Some said he had been invincible, that the land itself had tried to kill him and failed, that even death had needed to wait its turn. But in the end, he was just a man who crawled across a continent, who fought tooth and nail against the impossible, who refused to be forgotten. And as long as men tell stories of survival, they will tell the story of Hugh Glass.